Thank you, everybody, for being here today. My name is Doug Banks. I'm the executive editor of the Boston Business Journal. I'll be moderating our conversation today. Our panel today has three people, and our topic is change makers, why the future is now. We're going to be discussing change as a financing strategy, innovation as a way of attracting funding. And because the word now is in the title, we're going to talk about the importance of timing when it comes to entrepreneurship. Before we get started, why don't I have our panelists introduce themselves? If each of you could introduce yourself, just let our audience know who you are, what your day job is, and we have an author with us, so the most recent book that you've written and why you wrote it. And we'll start with Sarah. Go ahead, Sarah.
Sure. I'm Sarah Hodges. I'm a partner at Pillar VC. We're a seed stage venture capital firm here in Boston, co-founded by 22 CEOs of big billion-dollar companies here in town. And we're the first capital in for founders who are building the next generation of Pillar companies here in Boston.
Thanks, Sarah. Lori, why don't you go?
Hi, my name is Lori Cashman. I'm a co-founder of Viktorus Capital. We're an early stage venture firm that backs gender diverse teams in the consumer technology space.
Thank you. And Christopher?
Hey, everybody. Hey, Doug. Thanks for having us. Christopher Mirabile. I run Launchpad Venture Group, which is an early stage angel network, a very active group here in Boston. I also spend a lot of my time on the board at the Angel Capital Association. And I'm also a founder of a software company and have been doing a fair amount of writing. And I'm relieved to say that our most recent book was finished this summer. It's called The Entrepreneur's Journey. And it's an attempt to sort of look at startup lessons through a more narrative lens.
Thank you, Christopher. Why don't I come right back to you? You co-wrote that book with Ham Lord, whom I've known for years, Joe Mondato, two entrepreneurs and investors like yourself. You've both been founders, senior management team members, board members, I think for over at least 36 early stage companies at this point. And the three of you have invested literally hundreds of millions of dollars. Literally hundreds of companies and millions of dollars. One of the aspects of your book that I loved is that you have these different recurring themes that go along and you tell the stories of 17 different companies. One of those themes is the fateful role of timing. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about that from your book? And then Sarah and Lori, you can follow up with the fateful role of timing when you're looking at investments and working with entrepreneurs. Christopher?
There is so much pathos in the timing topic, right? And Sarah and Lori have seen this as well. You know, you can just have the right team and the right product and just be at the wrong moment in time. And it's just so painful. Sometimes it can be fixed with patience and additional capital or a temporary pivot to try to keep the lights on while you wait for the necessary prerequisites to get into place. But it's one of the more dramatic and heartbreaking of the startup tales. And so with this book, Doug, we've done a fair amount of writing that is sort of how-to manuals for investors, if you will. And we wanted to do something that was a little bit more readable, frankly, and a little bit more fun and a little bit more oriented around stories and maybe a little bit more broadly applied so that it would be interest to entrepreneurs. And we got together with Joe because Ham and I have a lot of Boston, East Coast roots, and a lot of our stories are from, this area. And Joe has been a prolific investor in Silicon Valley and has been a lecturer at Stanford Graduate School of Business. And so we sort of wanted to get some additional story DNA. And we spent a lot of time sort of thinking about lessons and boiling down into themes and then organizing great examples of stories around those themes. And timing was definitely one of the big ones.
Sarah or Lori, why don't you talk to us a little bit more about timing. The title of this panel is The Future is Now. What makes now a good time, or given everything else going on, maybe not such a good time in terms of some of the pitches that you're seeing and the companies that you're investing in? Lori, why don't you go?
Sure. We talk a lot about timing, both with our investors and with founders. And in many cases, we use the example of Google. I think it was the 14th search engine, right, to come on the scene. But so it doesn't always mean, the first to market means you're the best positioned. And in our roles, and I'm sure Sarah, you'd agree, like right now, there's a lot of disruption happening. I think the pandemic is, there are a lot of tensions and competing forces, and we're trying to anticipate what direction, various things will move in. And so with that comes conversation around the eventual market size of different opportunities. And so as we get intrigued and energized by new business models or new ventures, we have to think about what we believe the demand will be in the future. And, it's kind of obviously more art than science, but for sure, timing is a critical component of our investment decisions.
Yeah, and it's like the person on the longboard with the wave is really a great analogy, because you can start paddling too early, and then you're kind of all paddled out, and the wave hasn't arrived, and you can start paddling too late, and the wave just passes right under you, lifts you up for a second, and drops you back down. So timing is just a very, very challenging piece of it.
Well, I remember when I was an editor at Fast Company magazine back in 2000 and 2001, right as the dot-com bubble was at its peak. Second mover advantage was as important as first to market, and those were the conversations that we were having back then, and that was 20 years ago. Sarah, talk to us a little bit more about just the importance of timing.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Lori. We think this is really an incredible time to start a company. I think, we're all going through a lot of transformation right now. We're working in different ways. We're feeding ourselves in different ways, probably eating at home more often. Healthcare has completely transformed over the last couple of months here. And so from our perspective, there are just a whole lot of areas that are really ripe for disruption right now. And there are also a lot of people who, while certainly really busy, are finding themselves with headspace and mental space to think about creating something new. And so we think it's really a fantastic time to get started. In May, we were also thinking about how to transform ourselves as a firm. So much of how we met founders was by meeting them in person. And so we came up with the idea to start a virtual program called Frequency for people who were thinking about starting companies, thinking about taking that leap. And we were truly blown away. I think we've seen about 1,000 people apply for the program to date. So people are ready to start something new right now. And there are lots of opportunities from supply chain logistics to healthcare to e-commerce for people to dig into right now.
Doug, I would agree with Sarah wholeheartedly on that. And, the other interesting thing about the moment we're in right now, and Sarah, I think rightly pointed out that receptivity to new models is very high because everything's topsy-turvy right now. But access to talent, co-founders and first hires is very, very good right now. There's a lot of disruption in the economy and also, the opportunity cost. If your day job is a lot less secure, or your future in the traditional career track is less certain, maybe it's less risky, relatively speaking, to get out there and go after that dream or fix that problem that's really bothering you and you really feel it needs to be fixed. So I think it's a spectacular time to start something new.
Isn't it funny that you mentioned that if I remember correctly, the idea of fintech really took hold around 2008, 2009, when every banking and finance company shed thousands of people. And all of a sudden you had all these entrepreneurs, not necessarily because they wanted to be, but because, like you said, opportunity cost was such that why not go for it, right?
It can be, it doesn't always have to be societal. Sometimes it's technology. For example, one of the greatest stories of timing I think I've ever heard was, in the waning days of the sort of microcomputer era. Silicon Graphics was still a big player, and the cable industry was really gaining in power. And they got together and said, "Oh, wouldn't it be cool if our cable customers could just pick out what they wanted to watch and watch anything they wanted, on demand?" And they set up what was effectively the business model for Netflix. And it was a total and complete disaster because at that point in time in the 80s, there just wasn't the computing power and the software and the interfaces and the bandwidth to move that kind of video around. And it was clearly a genius idea. They were absolutely channeling what society wanted, but the technology just couldn't support the business model, and it was a disaster for everyone involved.
That's a great example.
Netflix came along and made it a win.
That's it. Well, after going through the DVD process first, once they realized that the postal service is probably not your best delivery mechanism for your technology, why not try streaming, right? Hey, you mentioned people, and I want to make sure that we talk about that. You, in your book, Christopher, you write about the importance of founding teams. Sarah and Lori, your firms both have very specific aims and goals around the teams for your portfolio companies. Talk about your approach to founder teams. Christopher, talk a little bit about what you have seen in founding teams. And then Sarah and Lori, why don't you tell our audience a little bit more about what your firms specifically look for? What are the key attributes? How do you identify those change agents? What do they need to look like now? Christopher, let's start it with you.
Well, great founders come in all shapes and sizes, and I think that it's really a mistake to take a very narrow aperture to sort of what you're looking for in a founder. But at the same time, I think it's really a mistake to underestimate the importance of that element, because the reality is that a lot of startup opportunities really boil down to, a team that's never done it before, creating a product that's never existed before, going after a market that doesn't exist yet. What could possibly go wrong, right? And no plan survives contact with the enemy. And so startup success is often very driven by founders sort of having the tenacity and the creativity and the EQ and the IQ to solve the problems, to revisit the plan, to fix as they go. And they end up being the one enduring thing. It's a little bit like the carpenter who says, oh yeah, this hammer, I've had this hammer my whole life. I've changed the handle 4 times and the head twice, right? It's like nothing of the original plan is still there, but that great team has sort of pirouetted and managed to sort of find a way through to market success. So it's a vitally, vitally important issue. And I think that we all sort of have a tendency to put our own life story and our own narrative and our own biases and our own perceptions around who that startup founder has to be. And I think we're all challenging ourselves to think more broadly about it and understand what it is we're looking for, right? And it is those things like tenacity and the ability to sort of get things done through other people and listen and learn and coach. And so it's a fascinating time right now if you're someone who thinks a lot about startup founders.
Lori, why don't we go to you next? The future is now. Viktorus Capital focuses on women-owned companies. Tell us a little bit more about why women-owned companies are the future and the future is now.
Well, we start with the data, and we know that diverse teams outperform on both top and bottom line metrics. So that's the thesis. And we really believe for us that the first filter is gender diversity. And we look at all measures of diversity with a core belief that, a talented team needs to reflect what the customer looks like. A talented team, both in the terms of management and the composition of the board, needs to have diverse perspectives and experience across all different dimensions. And that better positions them, to be able to draw the right insights to whether it's risk management or understanding where the growth opportunities are. We really believe that diversity on the team is important. And we certainly over-index on team. As Christopher was saying, we look a lot at the qualities of the team and the founder, grit and resilience and, coachability or a growth mindset, passion, the charisma, the ability to recruit talent. We also look for domain expertise. So we need to believe that this founder or this founding team is uniquely positioned to win. What is it about their story, their experience, their background that has gotten them to this point, and that will ensure that they'll be successful as they move forward. So that's really, I think, fundamental to everything we do, is to start with team. And then, of course, we look at business model. We talked about the eventual market size. We look at capital efficiency. But at its very core, that team is the most critical component.
Thanks, Sarah. What are some key attributes that you're looking for in your investments, in the people, your startups?
Sure. I love that you asked this question because the vast majority of what we're considering and looking for at the earliest stages are the people and the humans. I think, Christopher, as you said it, you nailed it. So much will change 12 months from now, but the people will still be the same. They'll still be leaving the business. So we oftentimes will pull ourselves back and say, are we too worried about a concern with the market or the size of the opportunity? Is this an exceptional human in front of us who really will just do great things? And so we think about three core characteristics. The first is really a blow through walls mentality and resilience, and the ability to get knocked down, pick yourself back up, find a path forward, not just once, but over and over again, because that's what the founder journey really involves. And then we look for people who are incredibly curious, always looking to learn more about themselves and the world around them. They're very self-aware, but they're interested in feedback from others and have conviction in their own decision making at the same time. And then the final characteristic we mentioned, we look for, Lori mentioned, which is so important, and it's that natural sales ability and the ability to create momentum and get people excited about your mission and vision and get them to want to join on board. I think some of the most successful founders are able to convince people with very little capital, very little compensation to join their team as team members or advisors in the early days because their vision is just infectious. And so those are some of the things we think about when we're considering founders to back.
Thank you, guys. Anything more to add on that, or I'll go to, because I have another couple more questions. All right, let me go to this the next idea that I would like to discuss, which is when we think about 2020, we really think about change. Obviously, at the Boston Business Journal, we have been publishing so many stories about pivots. So 3D printing companies that pivot to make medical devices because there's a need. Textile and apparel companies that are pivoting to make masks, face masks. And then, of course, racial equity, gender equity have been a huge issue this year as well. I'm wondering if we're going to see a pivot on race and gender the way we've seen pivots on products in 2020. What change do you see as the most likely to come in Q4 and 2021 as you're looking ahead? Will we see a pivot on race and gender the way we have in some of these other products?
Boy, I sure hope so. I'm not a social scientist, so it's hard to say, but I really am encouraged by the level of dialogue that we're having right now. I feel like I do feel like we're at a breakthrough moment where everybody, at least everybody in my network in the early stage investing community, just felt like, how could we not stop and mark this moment with George Floyd, saying I can't breathe. And I just I've had more sort of conscience-raising conversations about these issues in the last year than probably in the previous 2 or 3 years combined. So I kind of am an optimist, and I'm hopeful, Doug, that we will see a pivot, but all I can do is do my part.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Christopher. Lori?
I do believe that we're on the verge of a paradigm shift. I'm encouraged to see that, the big institutions, the endowments, pension funds, the big, capital deployers are beginning to open up to more transparency, to understand that they need to reflect their values in the way that they invest. And I think bringing that all the way down the chain to the consumer, we believe that in terms of a pivot, consumers are demanding transparency and authenticity, and they can see the values of, in our work, it's a consumer brand, but they can see what that brand stands for. They understand what the values of the founders and the company are, and they're voting with their dollars if they don't believe that aligns with their own personal values. And I think that will continue and deepen as we move forward.
Sarah, will we see race and gender diversity make a pivot when it comes to entrepreneurship? Will we see more Black entrepreneurs getting funded, more women's startups getting funded?
I agree with Lori and Christopher. I certainly hope so. I think it's been a gut-wrenching few months, but also pretty hope-inducing because there's a broader conversation and awareness about the lack of funding for underrepresented founders. And so I think it's certainly been a moment that's caused all of us in the venture industry to look internally at our team composition, at our portfolio composition, at some of our processes, at how we source and how we connect with founders and get beyond that first tier circle of known connections. So I think it's been a time for deep examination examination. And I agree with Lori. I think both institutional investors all the way down to the consumer are starting to demand that transparency. And so that gives me hope that we are headed in that direction.
Well, I'll share one statistic that we just recently published earlier in October. The annual number of SBA loans, these are the 7A loans, to Black businesses has decreased 84% since it peaked after the 2008 financial crisis. And that's despite a 48% growth in the economy and a 101% increase in bank deposits. And an 82% jump in commercial loans. So there's clearly been unequal access at the 7A loan program. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see more and more Black entrepreneurs going to folks like yourselves for private equity and entrepreneurship there. But let's, before we wrap up, we're going to, I want to make sure we wrap up on time, and I want to go to the other end of the spectrum now. Let's talk about exit strategies and during tumultuous times. If the future is now, which is the point of this panel, and startup investors are always looking for an exit, what do exit strategies look like now? We're seeing, is it IPO? We're seeing these special purpose acquisition companies flourishing all over the place. All of a sudden, everybody's talking about SPACs. So what do exit strategies look like now for you and your portfolio companies? Why don't we, Sarah, how about if I come right back to you?
Sure. We haven't seen a significant amount of change on this front, but we're also extremely early stage investors. So most of the companies in our portfolio have either recently raised capital or just starting to get out to market. I certainly think there are a number of companies that have been in hard hit sectors that have had to think about an acquisition sooner than they might have expected. On the other hand, I think there are founders who are looking inward and just truly showing that resilience and thinking about, well, how do I bridge my way to the market really recovering and my industry coming back? So, we haven't seen much change, but that's in part a product of how early we're operating.
Thanks, Sarah. Lori, how about you?
We are also early. We talk a lot about having multiple exit options. So if there's a path to profitability, if you're executing well, you ought to have an exit opportunity, whether it's private equity, possibly an IPO, some merger with a competitor. Jury's out on the SPACs, I think, but in any event, we believe that there's M&A activity at times like this, and there'll be M&A activity in the future, depending on the bigger companies needing to acquire new customer base, needing to acquire more of an e-commerce distribution channel. I think that we feel very good about the positioning of our companies and just encourage them to stay focused on execution.
Yeah, Doug, I think there's a lot of commonality between the three of us in terms of how we invest. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about deploying capital the way the three of us do is that we really are in for a pretty long haul, and our perspective on companies generally transcends the business cycle. We're in these companies for 6, 7, even 8 years or longer. And so an 18-month recession dip is a detail, especially if a company's still sort of trying to find product market fit or solve a science problem or, whatever the case may be. So that's something I think that we all have in common. I think another thing we have in common is that for the most part, accessing the public markets is complicated and much more than it was in the dot-com era in terms of the the availability and appetite for small IPOs. It's just it's harder to get out there, and you see SPACs in some ways are a symptom of that. It's a way of kind of backdooring your way into being public without having to do a full 1933 Act registration statement for the company itself. You just do it for the SPAC, but one way in which we differ a little bit, as angels and VCs, is that we are seeing a little bit of increase in non-traditional kinds of exits as angels, because we don't run a fund and we're not fiduciaries to LPs. Every angel makes her own or his own decision, and so we're seeing a fair amount of activity. For example, last year, we sold chunks of 5 different SaaS companies to growth stage PE firms. We've had exit opportunities to people like Lori and Sarah. They'll come into a company and they'll offer a little liquidity to early investors. We're seeing liquidity in the context of strategic investments. So angels are seeing a little bit of liquidity around the edges, that sort of those non-traditional kinds of paths to liquidity have increased. But for the most part, it's pretty much same old with a fad du jour on the side, a side helping of a fad.
Thanks, Christopher. That's great. Okay, I've got one last question for you. Sarah, I'm going to go to you first, and you can call this our speed round as we exit. What innovation would you like to see now that you haven't seen yet? Or another way, to put it another way, what idea would you fund tomorrow if somebody brought it to you?
Sure. We had 50 in-person events at Pillar last year. And so meeting with people face-to-face is really what feeds our soul. And we miss it so much right now. And I have yet to see a digital platform emerge that recreates that magic of meeting someone in person and captures that ability to have that deep, meaningful conversation with someone. So if someone could create that, I'm all in.
Thank you, Sarah. Great to see you. Lori, how about you?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I would just build on that in the sense of community. I feel like a lot of people are really craving interaction and relationships. And so whether there's a way to, have a hybrid of building community that's partly virtual and partly in person, I think I'll be curious to see what new models come out of this experience.
Thanks, Lori. And Christopher, how about you?
I'd invest in a way of getting big city sophisticated medical care out to small towns, some kind of a virtual or telemedicine solution that takes some of the learning and quality of care we associate with big medical centers and getting it out to the people who need it the most.
Well, if ever there was a year that telemedicine had the ears of the public, this is it. And as you mentioned, the technology is finally there to do it. And now the government is actually starting to allow it to be funded. So this could be the year. Well, I just want to thank the three of you for spending some time with us today. This has been a fascinating conversation. I want to thank Larry and his team for letting us have this conversation. And with that, I would just say thank you very much, everybody. It was great to see you, and hope everybody in the audience has a great day. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.